As much as I'd like to give you the full eye candy scenery for a sword review, I'm not hauling all of these up and down the rocks, I'm sorry. I don't have enough hands for this. So why do I have all 3 lengths of Supreme Cutter? Seems kind of overkill, right? Well, because Lancelot Chan, the guy who designed them, wanted me to have all 3 for testing to compare. He could have easily just sent me the mid-length and told me to extrapolate from there, but no, he sent me all 3, all for free, to review. If I want to prove that I'm not biased by finding things to criticize about these, this might be a bit of a struggle. Well, I didn't design or even make them myself, and as far as I know, Lancelot doesn't have any other swords that I might want to review in the future. So if I were to tear into these, there would be no harm done. Unless he has a habit of employing assassins that I'm not aware of. Alright, so Lancelot Chan has applied his several decades of experience with swords in coming up with a number of designs over the years that he kept refining over and over again. And so this is what he came up with as the Supreme Cutter. That's what it's called. And does it live up to its name? Yes. I don't expect to get through in one swing either. Whoa! Let's start at the bottom with the hilt. I've already made some observations about this recurve handle in a recent video. I'm just going to link that in the description below to not repeat myself here. Even though I can obviously feel the difference in handling, I can say I noticed a significant practical difference between this and the straight handle when actually cutting with them. There might be a slight advantage, and that's really what this is about. Lancelot tried to find many little tweaks to make sure that it performs as well as it possibly can. The handle has a simple utilitarian cord wrap, which I like a lot, actually. It may not look fancy, but it's perfect in terms of usability. It gives you exactly the right amount of traction. It's super comfortable, as is the handle shape in cross-section. You can feel the edge alignment perfectly. I'd say it's a good way to maximize efficiency and comfort. It's got a large disc guard, and this is quite common for Chinese swords. Speaking of which, Lancelot designed this from scratch, but it is obviously inspired by historical swords. The fit is extremely tight, as you can see here. There's no gap between the blade and the guard, or on the grip end either. I do like the contrast between the satin guard and pommel and the mirror polish blade. You can see the mirror polish is expertly done and without flaws, other than whatever I might have caused with use. I'll show you in a moment. Here's his logo. This steel doesn't seem to be quite as corrosion resistant as some that I've tried, even though I immediately wiped it after each cut on tatami and newspaper rolls. There's still some stains that are pretty stubborn. It might be hard to show on camera. I gently polished it with some Flitz polishing paste, and you can only see it at some angles. Just some very slight stains. You can of course always take more time to thoroughly polish everything, but personally I like signs of use, so I really don't mind. But it is something to keep in mind that it is very prone to stains from especially tatami water, but even the water from the soaked newspapers apparently does that. As far as sharpness is concerned, this is where these really distinguish themselves from other swords on the market. They are hand sharpened by Lancelot, who has extremely high standards for sharpness. Cult of Athena had some Supreme Cutters stocked with a factory edge, which are sold out, and Lancelot told me that any future swords will all be finished to this degree of sharpness, what he calls Lancelot sharp. Just feeling them with your fingers tells you that, yeah, they are indeed extremely sharp. And the cutting tests I did confirmed that big time. We'll get to that in a moment. But first off, handling. There's of course a difference between the sizes. The largest one, Ultra, is the heaviest, no surprise, at 1.66 kilograms. I'll post all the measurements in the description, including imperial units for those who don't like too much precision. The Supreme Cutter Compact is fairly katana-ish, if you will, in terms of overall size and proportions and handling. It does have a distal taper, a slight one. I'm not sure if you can see it in the video, but measurements will be downstairs as well. And this can be used in one hand, ideally in your main hand, but even offhand cuts, as I found out, are ludicrously effective with this. I did not expect to cut as well as I did with my weak hand. I would pick the middle-sized one, personally. I think I like the classic best in terms of size and proportions. It's just right. The Red Baron, whose size I very much like, is pretty much the same as the Supreme Cutter Classic. So there you go. The largest one, the Supreme Cutter Ultra, would be a bit much for one hand, but it is well enough balanced that you could, if you wanted to, particularly if you're a taller guy. But with two hands, it's quite nimble. You can do quick cuts in like a pretty small circle. And this is where you can do a lot with the long handle because you have that much leverage. So you can use that to your advantage and perform nice, tight cuts, which is exactly what my HEMA instructor Zion Niles did when cutting. Efficient, tight combat cuts that don't expose you any more than necessary. Of course, the compact version is the fastest and more agile, moves very easily, but they all do. They all handle quite well, even the largest one. And that's commendable because for this purpose, you could easily say, screw it, I'm gonna make it blade heavy to really make sure that it has plenty of power going through the target. Obviously, the more mass you have, the better it can cut potentially, but the harder recovery and follow-up and all that is, which if you're not designing it with the idea of being a great dueling sword or what have you, you could forgo that, but it should still handle well. And it does. It's going to be easier even when cutting static targets recreationally. It's still going to be easier to use, and especially if you do practice with historical techniques, it's going to work much better when the sword is balanced properly. And so in terms of handling, beautiful. No complaints here. I very much like them. At first, I was skeptical about the recurve handle because I'm not familiar with that and I wasn't quite sure if I like how that feels, but now I really don't mind. I still prefer straight handles, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. Works beautifully. The cutting performance can be a little difficult to convey because there's always somebody who cuts better, right? Somebody with more experience and more skill who can make it look more effortless and can make the same sword look much better. Obviously, if you have three different people on different skill levels, then the same sword can look either fairly crappy or like the greatest cutter ever. So what I go by is the subjective experience of comparing cuts I've done in the past. You know, of course, my skill has also changed, and definitely not in the form of linear progression, unfortunately. There have been ups and downs and everything. I've definitely been able to cut better in the past, but I know how different targets work. For example, tatami mats versus newspaper rolls of different thicknesses, different quality, etc., etc. There's a bunch of variables. So as you, over the years, gain more experience and cut a lot of different things, you figure out how you can subjectively evaluate it. All that blah, blah just means that these cut exceptionally well. Like definitely easily amongst the top 5 swords I've ever cut with, probably top 3. And by that I mean the Supreme Cutter as a whole. I didn't mean the top 3 spots are all taken by Supreme Cutters of different lengths. They rank extremely highly in terms of result relative to perceived effort. It's basically just a nerdy way of saying they be slicey as fuck. Now I didn't do abusive tests or blade on blade tests like parries with these because I feel like that's not the focus here. What they're meant for is cutting tatami mats and newspaper rolls and water bottles. It's a modern recreational cutter. Essentially, that's how I see it. And there was already some unintentional abuse there, especially with the Red Baron, when I hit the stake of the cutting stand very hard. The soaked newspaper rolls with polypropylene core are intended to simulate limbs, and they're definitely hard targets, both in the sense of difficulty They're more challenging than tatami mats, and they're also hard in the sense of much more dense and harder on the blade. So there's like 3 levels of hardness. There were also some cuts on a ballistic dummy head with a realistic skull analog, and skulls, as you can imagine, are rather dense, some more than others. And I was surprised to see not even minor edge damage. I was expecting something, some kind of rolling or mild chipping at least, but there's absolutely nothing. I can't even see reflections on the edge, not even enough to affect the sharpness. That is definitely remarkable and probably has to do both with the steel and also with the sharpening method. Because depending on how you do it, an edge can be more or less durable. Of course, it also is a matter of thickness. You know, if you make the blade too thin, or if you go too extreme with the angle, or if the steel isn't heat treated properly, you can run into issues. And of course, this can also accumulate. You know, sometimes you see more damage because a blade was simply used more. So if I were to chop into tree limbs aggressively with these, then we might eventually also see some damage, but that's to be expected. Every sword blade can and will be damaged, especially with improper use. Every time you hack into hard material with less than ideal edge alignment, you put a lot of stress, a lot of torque on such thin material all the way at the end. The edge can never be 100% durable. But acknowledging that nothing is indestructible, these blades are impressive for sure and can definitely stand up to hard use. And finally, if you want to talk about bias, this is my favorite one. Big surprise, right? I wouldn't say that it's objectively far better than the Supreme Cutters. I would say if I had to rate them as objectively as I can, I would say it's pretty much identical in terms of overall quality and cutting power. I would give a slight edge, to this one, the Red Baron. If I were to give them a score, you know, like a numbered score, say out of 10, and I were to say the Supreme Cutters are a 9.7 out of 10, always leaving a little bit of room because they could always be the crazy next thing, right? Then this would be a 9.8, maybe, or 9.6, 9.7, something like that. Either way, a very high number. And what I love about that is it shows that there are certain qualities a blade can have that transcend all these considerations about straight or curved or single or double-edged and blah, 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 all of that. You can have 2 blades that are very different, you know, one being curved and fairly thick, the other being straight and thinner and wider, and they cut pretty much identically. Not identically, really, you'll feel the difference when you cut with them, but they cut equally well, I would argue. I said, if I had to pick one, this is maybe slightly better, like in terms of how easy it makes it. Of course, the main reason for that is, again, the edge. And in this case, it's also just how thin the blade is. I mean, you can see that, right? It's wide and thin, and because there's pretty much no profile taper, it just stays wide all the way throughout, you're sacrificing effective thrusts by giving it essentially no point, but you're maximizing the cutting ability. This sword here is pretty much the opposite. It has a very broad blade at the base, and then it tapers substantially. So this makes for excellent thrusts. But because of that, the center of percussion, the point where you want to impact, where the cut is going to be the most effective, is fairly low. So this is my reach. From the test cutting, I can say that it still cuts well about here. So I'm actually getting a little bit more reach, effective reach out of this, even though the blade is shorter. Now with the Red Baron, I can squeeze myself all the way against the wall, and I can still deliver an effective cut. You can imagine if you were to cut with just the tip of the blade, that would still be pretty effective because that is still quite a wide blade. So it still has a decent amount of mass, even though it's rather thin, right? So still limited penetration, obviously. It's better to cut lower, but you can still use the blade pretty high up, which, considering that this blade is already this long, is kind of nuts, right? Doesn't have as much of a distal taper. I'm not sure if that's noticeable. It has one, but not that much. And I'm guessing the handle does a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of balancing it. I mean, it's a relatively large pommel and guard as well, and then the handle does a lot. I can do some very tight movements just by leveraging the handle. The balance is ridiculously good. It's better than the Supreme Cutters. I mean, for my taste, shall we say, because the interesting thing is this actually weighs more than the Supreme Cutter Ultra, but it feels lighter. Like, I could definitely use this with one hand. And again, cutting with one hand was surprisingly effective. And with two hands is kind of ridiculous. You know, just how easily you can maneuver, disengages, super easy. And really all you need to do for an effective cut is just extend it pretty much. Just let it shoot forward, and this is already going to do quite a bit of damage in an unarmored duel. On the battlefield, that's where the drunk mercenary overswing comes in. Very agile, extremely nimble, especially for the size. It's kind of insane. The fit and finish on this one is also excellent, as you can see here. No gap, and I quite like the blackened finish on this Katzbalgar style S-guard. It looks great, it's effective for protecting the hand. And on this side as well, you can see nice tight fit. The wrap is the same as for the Supreme Cutters, just red here, which is quite nice. And the pommel also has the blackened finish. You know, same thing here, where it's peened, it's polished properly, and overall, you know, the blade shape is flawless, again, just like the Supreme Cutters, and the edge is just as sharp. There's nothing at all wrong with that. Everything I said about the Supreme Cutters, I can also say about the Red Baron. The scabbard is also well made. I like that it has these decorative strips. Nice tight fit, no rattle. It doesn't come with a sword belt, so there's no way to actually wear it other than sticking it through your belt, but you can always make something. With the Red Baron, it pays to be a little more careful because it is double-edged, so it's easy to scrape the edges, but not an issue. Edge retention doesn't seem to be a problem either with the steel. I'm not particularly familiar with this steel. It's often compared to 5160 spring steel, but it is different. Really what I care about is how well heat treated it is and how well it performs, and there's no concerns here at all. So in terms of design, this is also something that he designed inspired by historical originals, but it's still Lancelot's own design as such. It wouldn't be terribly unusual if sometimes you do see blades like this without a pronounced point. It's not just for executioner swords. They did that for other reasons sometimes. As I said, basically you're prioritizing the cut over the thrust, and you could still thrust with it. In fact, I want to test that at some point in the future because that should be interesting. Anyway, so that's about all I've got to say. This is probably pretty long already. So these all cut fantastically well and are remarkably well made. There's not a single thing I can criticize. I mean, I tried, but I can't think of anything. It would be nice if the scabbards had some kind of belt attachment or even came with a sword belt, but that would cost extra. Really, the only downside I can think of is availability. There aren't that many to go around. Lancelot, as said, has very high standards, and he meticulously quality controls every single one and sharpens them by hand and finishes everything to the point where he's perfectly satisfied. And I really don't see what else you could do to them. Cutting performance speaks for itself. Lancelot himself has also done plenty of tests. If you're skeptical about the maker's bias, which of course there's always some inherently, there are other people as well who have done plenty of test cuts, and it all turns out to be the same way. Everybody notices that it's quite easy for beginners to cut with. I mean, one of my friends has experience in kendo, but has never really practiced cutting. He's done like 1 or 2 cutting sessions before this, but otherwise has never explicitly practiced cutting. And he delivered some beautifully smooth cuts with the Supreme Cutter. By the way, if you're wondering why are not all sword blades made like this to cut crazy well, it just depends on the purpose and application. Would you want to take this to a historical battlefield where the blade encounters metal armor and other swords and shields and all of this to maximize cutting performance as much as possible? You have to sacrifice something. In this case, it's not going to be quite as strong as a thicker blade with a steeper bevel, perhaps. In terms of pure strength and durability, the Supreme Cutter should theoretically be a little better because they have a thick spine. Being single-edged, you can make the blade a little bit thicker overall, which is also why I find that this cuts a little bit better than the Supreme Cutters. Anyway, I've babbled long enough. You get it. These are awesome swords. As said, link down below. I hope you found this interesting and helpful. Thanks for watching and stay sharp.